Okay, so from here on, I am going to use the standard 16:9 screen format. Since it's so widely used, it's a standard for PC games and is pretty close to cinema format. But all the things that you hear from onwards will work for any format. But I just want to demo on the most common item. Now we're going to discuss what most people assume a composition class would teach you. Not the aspect ratio, but rather the inside of the canvas. And a lot of times you'll see these crazy things like Fibonacci spirals or the rules of thirds grid or all these crazy lines going everywhere. But I'm going to break it down super simple, alright? You can think of it this way. All screens can be broken down into these classic fractions. Number one is the 50-50. After that, 10-30. 10 on this side and 20 on this side. So together, this would be 1/3 and this one would be 2/3. Just so you guys know your fractions. After that, you have the 20-80 and then the 10-90. You can do this either vertically or horizontally. So for example, if you want to do it vertically, then you would be able to move this bar however much you'd like. So for example, something more like 10-90. Here's something that would be like more 50-50, and then something that would be more like 2/3 or 1/3. When you divide your screen in half, then your composition gives off a very balanced feeling. It should show harmony and symmetry, and is the classic staple of the director Wes Anderson. He absolutely loves symmetry. So it always gives off a very calculated and geometric look. Almost like a perfect look. The next that you would see is your 10-30 or 20-30, which is probably the most commonly used division. You will see this pretty much anywhere because it's not just the easiest to use, but it's also kind of just the most understandable. It's just normal, it's not as perfect as the 50-50 where everything is in half, and it's also not as crazy as the next one we'll look at, which is the 20-80. The 20-80 is when things start to get a little bit more pushed. Typically is to show off a lot of background. And what I mean by 20-80 and all these different fraction lines is that sometimes it refers to the horizon line. It can also refer to simply wherever you see a very big break in your piece. Because essentially when we're looking at things on the screen, our eyes are trying to figure out what is being broken apart. And so in this case, the water and the sky, so the water and the sky are two different portions. So you can consider that as a break line, and that break line would be at roughly around kind of the 20-80 mark. Here's another example of a 20-80, and again, like I said, it's typically used to show off a lot of background and is great for what is known as arrival shots, or when you're being introduced to the newest city or something in a movie or game. The more extreme version of that would be the 10-90, where it is super extreme. The line cut is very low. So you can see here, in this case, in The Secret Life of Walter, the line cut would be where the people are standing on their horizon line. It's very rare, but it can also feel very dynamic and gives a great shock value when it shows up on the screen. It's hyper exaggerated, and typically, unless we're doing storyboards or keyframes, you may not usually see this in concept art. But let's be real, because usually within concept art and concept art paintings, we're trying to paint the average scene from a movie or explore what the world would look like. So our bread and butter would be the 10-30, such as this, or the 20-80. Technically, this would be a bit more of like a 10-90 in terms of where the sky and the blue hits, but if you divide it by the exact horizon line, then it would be a perfect 20-80. Now, that being said, the human eye is naturally drawn to the bigger space. So if we divide this by, say, 20, and then this was by 80, then your eye will naturally go to the portion that is 80, not the portion that is 20. A trick that would utilize this then will be that you put your subject matter in the bigger portion of the screen, and you would try to avoid putting it in the 20 aspect of the screen. Of course, this is just good to know and not an actual law that you have to abide by. But when you're painting backgrounds for animation or considering backgrounds, if your main focus is the character, then you'll want the background to be relatively empty so that the character can stand out. So in this case here, since the screen is divided by 10-30, our character would naturally sit somewhere around here. because our eye, again, is naturally drawn to the bigger space. In fact, if you ever want to pursue being a background painter, then they say that your painting should actually feel a little bit empty or plain, because that way the characters will stand out. Alright, so now that you know these fractions, you can put them in anywhere and you can mix and match them. For example, in this piece in Moonlight, we already talked about how it's around a 20/80 fraction, but it can also be 50/50 if you split it down the line. Or for example, on this piece here again, even though we talked about how it's 10/30, you can also split it in half as a symmetrical piece. The question is then, why do I need to split the frame at all? Why can't I just plop things like wherever the heck I want? Like a little bit of this and a little bit of that everywhere. It's because just like with black and white, we need visual clarity. Our mind naturally organizes things, so we like to see images that are perfectly composed. For example, this is a completely normal photo that anyone could take, and this photo will never look as good as one taken by a professional photographer who studied this stuff for 2 years or more in school. As you can see, if an actual photographer took it, then they would be able to know how to compose the scene so that it feels like it has meaning and it gives it depth. Here's another example where the photographer has the same location, but you can see the results are drastically different depending on how you compose the piece. I promise you, it's not just about how the colors look, but the fact that they were able to frame the camera in a very specific way evokes a much more cinematic and storytelling feeling. And that brings us to the rule of thirds, which is probably the most classic thing you'll learn in composition, where you split the canvas into thirds on both sides. So you split it here, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. You also split it this way, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That's essentially your rule of thirds. And to be able to draw people's eyes to something, that you put the main focus point on the intersection right here. This is why Sherlock's face intersects perfectly with this imaginary line. The reason why filmmakers do this is because if you put your focal point smack in the middle, then something about it just feels too fake. And if you put your focal point too much on the side, then it feels like something is getting cut off. Therefore, filmmakers love to rely on the rule of thirds to make sure that they accurately put something on the screen so that most people will be able to see it, feels natural, and also naturally leads the eye to somewhere. So for example, here, Linguini's face is perfectly on the intersection. And even though the villain isn't exactly positioned correctly, he is still pretty much taking these intersections right here, just so that our eye perfectly meets it. This is all calculated. I promise you, none of this stuff is coincidental. At the end of the day, it's all about producing a natural image, one that makes you feel the most comfort, at peace, or immersed. Or if you wanted to draw someone's eye to something, almost quite literally here, then you put the most important items directly on the intersections. Right here, they literally have the eyes on the intersections. Like, you cannot get more obvious with that. So let's take a look at this example in a piece by Ryan Lang for Doctor Strange. Instead of having his characters be placed specifically directly in the middle, the characters are purposefully positioned to be at around the 10:30 mark. This is so that you feel a lot more of a dynamic angle and you can capture the beautiful long sweep that Doctor Strange is doing right here. And what's even more wonderful is that you have clearly one character on this side and another character on this side. And like we said, since our eye naturally goes to the side with a bigger space, then your eye will naturally go towards this side, where perfectly you meet with the main character, Doctor Strange. So try it out on some of your favorite movies or paintings, and you'll definitely start to see these different ratios and fractions. Also, let me get something clear. I just taught you a bunch of ways to divide the screens into all of these fractions, and I just taught you the rule of thirds, but I disagree with their names. It is not a rule. These are guidelines. I do not want you to take a ruler to your monitor and measure out every inch, making sure everything hits exactly on the intersection. If movies were made this way, nothing would ever get done. These are only guidelines to help you make a decision and roughly place your objects. They don't need to be spot on, just kind of in the vicinity. is to prevent you from making your piece way too symmetric, and to avoid putting your focal point way too far off on the side, so your audience doesn't even know what they're looking at anymore. There's a golden quote that I learned from the legendary Bill Perkins, who art directed the classic Disney films such as Aladdin or Little Mermaid, and he says, "There are no rules. There are only consequences." There is nothing stopping you from putting your focal point on the side of the painting, but the consequence is that your audience will lean their ways all the way to the side of the canvas and think that you've cropped it or something. You can always break the rules and not listen to the guidelines at all. But most often than not, these guidelines are tested and true, and it's a fantastic place to start and they will never go wrong. If you're ever confused as to where your horizon should be, you can totally go for the classic 20-30, and you'd have absolutely no problem. Or place your character on a rule of thirds intersection, like right here, and go from there. You'll have a solid piece by the end of it. And as you get more comfortable, you may want to explore a bit more and see what kind of weird compositions that you can come up with. But I would recommend for people starting out, stick to these guidelines, and you will produce a solid piece every single time. Because after all, I am teaching you the foolproof concept painting, and the rule of thirds is just about as foolproof as you can get. And once you feel like you understand a lot more, then you'll be able to take on a lot more different compositions and things that give yourself like personal value, however you would like to organize your piece. But you'll be able to organize your piece in a way that you can also help your audience understand what you're trying to see. Now, let's get into even more detail about composition, and you can rejoice because there are no fractions in this one.